All right, everybody, welcome to BCMA Webinar number 10, Planning Successful Exhibitions. That's supposed to say learning, but I have a cold this week, so I can't spell. I'm sorry. We're also leaning from failure and planning for success. Obviously, you can tell that I did this in a rush and with far too much or far too little Tylenol. My name is Ben Fast. I am the Programs and Member Services Coordinator for the BC Museums Association, and I'm here to help you get through this webinar, or perhaps maybe I need you to help me get through it. I see there's already some people that have found the chat icon. Thanks, Tammy. I did get all the letters right in there, just not all in the right order. But you can send me an email at bfast@museumsassociation or assn.bc.ca. You can also use the chat window if you'd like. And I have to say that this week is kind of a fun week for me because, of course, it is the Olympics. And as you all know, Canada is doing really well. I'm a big sports fan, and I love the Olympics. And I'm also very excited because, of course, we have 81 people registered for this webinar. So it has me feeling a bit like Scott Moyer in this one. We all remember where we were last night when we saw that happen. What a great show by them. And it made me think a little bit about the Olympics and what that would do for museums. So maybe Museum Olympics, you'd have the project that gets away. I'm sort of like this unfortunate skeleton person who lost their sled in the middle of the track. Hopefully we don't have too many of those. Or maybe you'd feel like you're rocking the curveball question from the grade 3 tour. I know that as a former museum interpreter, I've had a couple weird questions come out, and if you can get it right and that teacher gives you that look, you feel exactly like Mike McEwen here, nailing that curling draw. Or maybe knowing you scored the best job in the cultural field. I think we're all excited to be museum workers, and we all feel just as good as this American snowboarder here. I believe they won the gold a couple nights ago. Anyways, if you have something that you think fits your job, something like your museum sport, maybe a photo of you if you have a sport-related item, or maybe a GIF if you have something funny to share, perhaps your latest win or maybe your latest crash, you can share it with us on Twitter using the hashtag Museum Olympics and also our handle there at BC Museums ASSN. Either one, we'd be glad to have you share it with us. Now I'm going to throw it, just before I do that, I should say how to use this webinar. If you're reading this, you're already doing great, but stop yelling, we can't hear you or see you. There's no webinar requirements for a webcam or a microphone on this. You're just here to watch, and you can type questions using the Q&A feature. Now this is our first time using this feature. We used to use the chat, but you'll find a Q&A button or a question and answer button up in probably your top left corner, depending on your computer. This is a great way to ask questions so that everybody can see them, and it's a little bit easier for us to manage it actually rather than using the chat window. But we'll be watching both just in case you get your questions out, and we'll read out everybody's questions to make sure that everybody hears them and sees them. Now I'm going to throw it over to Tim Willis. Tim Willis is a BC Museum legend. I think most people from BC know him for that. He is a visitor experience expert. He started at the Royal Alberta Museum and then later moved on to the Royal BC Museum. And so with that, you can probably guess that he is British. Today, he is a museum consultant working with museums all across BC as well as all across North America and the world, as far as I believe. And he is definitely a friend of the BCMA. If you were at our conference in October in Victoria, Tim was the MC for our gala night, as well as being the host of one of our BCMA grant program listening sessions or info sessions. So Tim is very much loved here in the office, and I would like to throw it over to Tim for this month's presentation. Hello, Tim.
Hi, Ben. That's very nice of you. Let me just, I'm going to just share my screen with you. I hope you're seeing it all. There. Lovely.
Looks good.
All right. Hello, everybody. You know, I find this format rather odd in a way because I'm used to talking to groups of people, but not being able to see you or hear you is a little bit weird. But there I am. This is me basking in the glow of my computer screen. I think I need to get out more. I'm sorry I can't see you. I know you're all there, and it's great that there are people from across the country and even some from across the border. So thank you very much for joining me at whatever hour of the day it is with you. I'd like to think with you today, I'd like to take you on a bit of a journey actually, but I'd like to think together about exhibitions. After many years leading exhibition departments and now working as a consultant, I still find myself surprised by how difficult it seems to be to get exhibitions right. Sometimes you actually wonder whether designing an exhibition is like rocket science. I mean, certainly every exhibition is different, every visitor is different, so perhaps it's not surprising that it's not easy to get it right. This webinar doesn't focus on how to design. That's impossible to do in 45 minutes or so, but rather to how to think about exhibitions and their creation, which I think is critical. I think the way in which we make decisions as we plan exhibitions is as important as design. So I propose we explore some exhibitions from around the world and have a bit of fun learning from their failures, as well as their successes. And then we're going to look at 12 principles or ways to think about exhibitions that might help you as you develop your next exhibition. It was 10 principles, but now I've changed the rule, it's 12. I'd like to say a few words by way of a preface. This is where I grew up. It's a very beautiful part of the west of England, the Cotswold Hills. When I was 9, I would walk home from school. And on my way was our local museum. It was, and it still is, free of charge. And I would drop in there regularly and daydream. One exhibit in particular captured my imagination. It was this wolfskin coat. It belonged to this man, Edward Wilson. Wilson lived in my hometown. He cycled the same country lanes. He sketched birds and flowers and trees. And he died with Scott, Captain Scott, in March 1912, on their way home back from the South Pole. He's immortalized in statuary. In fact, the museum is now named after him. It's funny how those little encounters that you have with a museum, often when you're a child, have a lasting effect. This encounter in particular left me with a lifelong fascination with polar exploration. And it serves in a way, this story serves as a beacon for me, reminding me of the powerful potential of exhibitions. I'm now going backwards. I don't want to do that. Let's go forwards. What I'd like to do is take you on a journey around the world, first of all. We live perhaps in a golden age of exhibition and museum building. In 2012, the American Alliance of Museums reported that American museums received 850 million visitors, which is more than all the big league sporting events and theme parks combined. In Sweden, 3 out of 4 adults this year will visit a museum. There is a glorious profusion of museums and exhibitions of the most incredible diversity. Let's start here with a museum that just opened. And I'd like to thank my colleague, our colleague, Amanda Snyder in Kelowna, who sent me some amazing images of the Louvre, Abu Dhabi, from her recent visit. One in particular just captured my imagination. It was foggy on the day that Amanda went to the museum, and the fog actually entered the atrium, the lobby of the museum. And that's what you're seeing here in this image. Incredible museums of great architectural diversity opening. This is Centro Botín in Santander, Spain. Beautiful new museum by Renzo Piano. We have glorious little museums as well. I can't think of a more lovely location than the Pender Island Museum, which I visited and did a little work with them last year. We have museums dedicated to issues of identity, like the National Museum of African American History and Culture, a Smithsonian museum in Washington that recently opened. Also, surprisingly, a new museum in Ramallah, the Palestine Museum. We have museums that are not really museums, that are, in a way, playthings in themselves. This is Lego House in Denmark. And this is a museum I'm afraid I will never visit. This is the Messner Mountain Museum, one of 5 museums that is opening in the Tyrol Alpine region, celebrating mountains and mountaineering. Museums that are that tell their story in the fabric of their building as well as in their exhibitions, like the incredibly powerful 9/11 Museum and Memorial in New York City. And this museum, one of my favorites, this is the Churchill War Room, which is actually, in a way, a time capsule, a place that was sealed after the Second World War. And when it was reopened, was revealed this incredible time capsule of the place in which Churchill and his cabinet planned the defense of Britain during the Second World War. People are fascinated by museums. I'm as fascinated going into museums to watch people and their reaction to what they're seeing. This is a group of people standing in front of the Night Watch, Rembrandt's masterpiece in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. Museums devoted sometimes to telling a singular story. The South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology, which more recently has dedicated itself to the exploration and research and interpretation of the discovery of Otzi, the Iceman, a 5,000-year-old body discovered melting from a glacier. We have museums that define the definition of museum. This wonderful exploratory museum, the City Museum in St. Louis, in which the museum itself is an artifact composed of fabric, the fabric of a city. You know, we have exhibitions now touring science museums and also natural history museums, which are endeavors, partnerships between museums and private enterprise in order to, yes, educate people, but also to generate a lot of money. And surprising endeavors by some of the world's most famous museums. This incredible exhibition about David Bowie, opening in 2012 at the venerated Victoria and Albert Museum, broke all box office records, selling out every single day of its run. And we have, of course, the Torrington Gopher Hole Museum in Alberta, which is in a class of its own. But despite this golden age of museum creation, despite my anticipation when I approach every museum I visit, why is there sometimes a sense of being underwhelmed when I tour the exhibitions? I think the roots of that lie in many things, and let's just take a look at some of the reasons that exhibitions don't reach their potential. Where do exhibitions commonly fail? First, though, I should make a confession that I have been guilty of exhibition failure in many occasions. I often think of exhibition creation as a practice, a bit like yoga or meditation. It's something that you never get quite right. And often along the way of our careers, our experience, we fail. The question is, do we learn from failure? And first, I should start with one of my failures. In fact, the award for the worst exhibition in the world goes to me. I'm not going to show you the exhibition. I'm just going to show you, and this speaks for itself, the title graphic, the introduction to the exhibition, The Beauty and Science of Birds, which for some unexplained reason is repeated in probably the most unlovely fashion. And yes, you are seeing in the centerpiece of the exhibition introduction panel a thermostat. This was not an exhibition that I was involved in designing, but an exhibition that I failed to change when I was director of exhibitions. One of the first challenges I think museum exhibitions have when it comes to connecting with visitors is the question of simply conveying what the exhibition is about. A few years ago, I was invited to speak at a conference in Las Vegas. I actually don't like Las Vegas very much, but I do love deserts. And so I decided to go for a drive out of Las Vegas, and I came upon the Red Rock State Park. This is an image of it, and a sign pointing me to a brand new interpretive center, the Red Rock State Park Interpretive Center, in which must have cost many millions of dollars to create. It has a whole suite of outdoor exhibits that tell you everything about the geology of the state park, the history, the natural history of the state park, the archaeology. And then you go into a rather magnificent interpretive center in which, and this is only a section of it, this incredible slot window looking out onto the Red Rock Canyon itself. At no point during the visit could I find the answer to the question of why is the Red Rock red? Despite the fact that I am looking at a Red Rock Canyon, you'll see that there's no interpretation on the ledge of this window. I turned to my right to ask the ranger, can you tell me, sir, why the Red Rock is red? And he said, you see that little book on the stand, which we've just recently put in front of this window. If you go to page 11 and read down a bit, you'll find the answer. My point is that it's not always transparent to museum visitors when they step into an exhibition what this is going to be about. This extraordinary lobby, incredibly, I should say that I will say where it is. It's at the Natural History Museum in London. It reminds me a bit of Caesar's Palace. I don't quite know what's going on here. I certainly was completely confused by the intent of the exhibition, which actually is about the geology of the world. But to create such a magnificent introduction to a gallery, and then to make it so hard to discern what the exhibition is about, is one of the ways in which exhibitions fail. I can't read it. Perhaps one of the most simple areas of failure that one can possibly imagine. And I can tell you that, and I know from experience, that the team that put this exhibition together probably in their planning meetings very rarely mentioned the visitor as a consideration. Otherwise, I can't imagine why on earth you would put a label in white type on a transparent background onto a light-colored wall. It just doesn't work. You can't put text on windows, and yet we do, and then make it incredibly hard for people to read. This is from a very good exhibition called The Black Leather Jacket from the Experience Music Project. But you can see what I mean. The label in the really rather ugly placement in the bottom right of the case is not only obscured by a shadow from the object itself, but the sleeve of the object is actually overhanging the label. And I don't know quite what to say about this. Some of you may know where this is. It's at the Royal Ontario Museum. One thing I will say is if you're a French speaker, I think the museum perhaps should apologize, because you're going to have to get onto your hands and knees to read the bottom text. I could imagine all sorts of reasons as to why this label, this panel, the introduction to, in fact, to the dinosaur gallery was created like this. but it certainly has nothing to do with the visitor. I won't read it is another common feeling that I have when I go into exhibitions. Steve Bitgood, American researcher, wrote this, which I think this beautiful quote: "Since the beginning of museums, exhibit labels have been used as instruments of torture on helpless visitors." I don't know how, and I'm pretty sure that most people will not read an exhibition label that looks like this. In fact, what happens when visitors approach exhibit labels with too much text or badly designed text is that they make an appraisal almost subconsciously and decide to pass it by. I'm sorry to pick on the black leather jacket again, but this is indeed what happened with this exhibition. I decided to stand by the exhibition's introduction. And we could certainly criticize it from a graphic design point of view. But this simply has way too much text. So in the 20 minutes that I spent standing by this exhibition introduction, I can tell you that absolutely no visitors, and it was a busy day, no visitors read it. Why have an exhibition that nobody's going to read? I won't do it is another common problem encountered by interactive exhibits or uses of technology where an assumption has been made that is wrong. The Nature Plus program at the Darwin Centre at the Natural History Museum in London was a huge investment by the museum in a technology whereby visitors would use a card and they would get it scanned near an exhibit that had content that interests them. They would then download this information to their own computers. The only problem is nobody really wanted to do it. They were enjoying their museum visit, but the last thing they really wanted to do was scan this card. And that similar experiences have been found by people who've tried to, for the best of reasons, use things like QR codes in order to deliver enriched information. People simply don't want to scan a QR code. It's not something they feel like doing when they come to a museum. I'm repelled by it. I mean, I'm not quite sure what went on in the designer's mind when they created a display case of beautiful Celtic jewelry, ancient Celtic jewelry, and then put it in the display case. I guess it's an artistic installation. It's certainly not something I would be attracted to explore, and nor is this. Probably one of the ugliest display cases I've ever seen. So the way in which you display material, the beauty, the aesthetic balance and effect of a display case is really important. And when you do something like this, and there probably are 10 things wrong with this display case, people simply look at it and reject it. I found this very odd. This is actually from the Rijksmuseum, these busts, which are really quite extraordinary. It's just that the placement of the bust on the deck of the display case says to me this isn't really important. And to be honest, it looks odd. I think there is a way in which, and we'll explore that a little bit, the way in which to showcase your objects to the very best effect. It's exhausting me is a common issue with museum exhibitions that try to do too much. There is so much going on here, 2 languages, graphics, maps, words, objects. It's simply overwhelming. And we all know that museum fatigue sets in. In fact, it sets in within about 40 minutes. And fatigue is not just physical fatigue, it's mental overload from this sort of thing. I have to say, so many displays in exhibits just leave me cold. They simply don't draw me in or connect with me as a human being. They are simply sterile. And I think the other thing we have to pay attention to is the fact that people aren't paying attention. I, again, am fascinated by the phenomenon of visitor behavior in exhibitions, and especially around famous objects, in this case, the Rosetta Stone. but you'll be very lucky to get close to the Mona Lisa these days. Just listen to what Tom Rackman wrote in The New Yorker not long ago. He said this: "After all the artist's struggles, all the critical quarrels, all the millions paid for grand works, after all that, how long will a museum visitor typically stand before a masterpiece? About 28 seconds, according to a recent study. The average has held steady during the past 15 years, though the behavior of museum visitors has changed. Today, many aren't there just to gaze. They've come for selfies." And so we get this kind of thing going on, which I'm not quite sure, I'm pretty sure that Leonardo didn't have in mind when he created the Mona Lisa. And we as exhibit designers or developers or planners have certainly got to pay attention to. But it is a phenomenon that is overwhelming certain museum exhibits these days, and it is an issue. So let me then take you through 12 principles. This is no hard and fast rule or law. This is me thinking back on my museum practice over the years, and to be honest about my museum practice today as we struggle to try and get it right. But these are 12 things that I think are worth paying attention to as we put together our heads as exhibit teams in the creation of an exhibition. First of all, is to have a point. I think it really crucial. I'm convinced of this after thinking about it and practicing it for a while now. It is really important that exhibitions have a big idea. A big idea essentially is one sentence, a statement that contains a single idea, which is the central purpose of the exhibition. And all content of the exhibition supports the big idea. This is a difficult practice to enact, but and it is actually a very difficult challenge for a curator, an interpretive planner, a designer to get their heads around what the big idea of an exhibition should be. A big idea is not a topic. It is an idea. It is a point of view. And if you can craft a big idea that works, then you have at the heart of your exhibition a spine that will work, that will serve you in adding flesh to the exhibition. It is not, it's surprising when you ask exhibit team members what the exhibition is actually about, how often they will struggle to answer this question. And yet, isn't that the thing that we should all know precisely when we are putting an exhibition together? This is not a big idea. Visitors will learn about the molecular structure, chemical reactions, and the scientific process of analyzing unknown substances. It's not a big idea because it's absolutely impossible to understand what it's talking about. But this is a big idea. Now, you would imagine when the exhibit developers were putting together an exhibition on the Titanic, that they might be thinking that this exhibition is about magnificent ambition, colossal engineering feat, tragedy. But that wasn't the big idea behind the Titanic and Artifact exhibition. It was this. The big idea is that the Titanic is a story driven by class. That class determined the design of the Titanic, its structure. That class determined the experience you would have as a visitor, as a passenger on the Titanic. And that class played a very big part in determining in the tragedy whether you lived or died. My second principle is the notion of revealing something. I'm going to say I have a confession to make. For years, I heard the name Freeman Tilden, and his principles of interpretation. And I didn't read the book. I knew that it was worthy. I knew that a lot of people thought very highly of Freeman Tilden's writing. And it was only after, late in my practice, I won't tell you when, that I actually bought the book and read it. And I was so moved by it, I urge you all to read Interpreting Our Heritage, written in 1957 by Freeman Tilden, the grand old man of the US Park Service interpretation. Tilden thought very carefully about how the US Park Service told its story, and he developed a very simple suite of principles. They are as true today as they were back then, and they are really useful guidances to us all. And this is what Freeman Tilden said interpretation is. It is to reveal something of the beauty and wonder, the inspiration and meaning that lies behind what the visitor can, with his or her senses, perceive. This is a 1903 penny. It was featured in the incredibly successful project called The History of the World in 100 Objects by the British Museum, in which Neil MacGregor, the then director of the British Museum, took 100 objects from the British Museum's collection and used them to tell a story of civilization. It is an exemplary exercise in interpretation, particularly this one, I feel. Because for me, this is a case of a simple object serving as a portal to a greater world, to a bigger world, and revealing something much bigger than itself. The fact of this penny is that in 1903, women who were part of the suffragette movement in Britain stamped the message "Votes for Women" on pennies. But this is what Neil MacGregor said about the penny in The History of the World in 100 Objects. He said this: "Power is not given willingly, but taken. On the front side is a portrait of Edward VII, balding and powerful. Right over his face is the word votes, over his ear for, and across his neck women. The message on the coin was meant to circulate widely and indefinitely." I think we need to care more about presentation, whether it's the presentation of a treasure or a modest object. I think we need to work harder at bringing out the best of that object. Let me show you just a couple of images from a remarkable object at the city of the Museum of London. It is a debtor's prison from the 1700s. The actual wood lining of the prison cell itself, and you step into that prison cell. And because of the use of raked lighting from an angle, you can pick out the messages that the prisoners carved over the decades as they spent their sorrowful time in this prison. It is a beautiful, simple presentation made possible really through very thoughtful lighting design. The message here, by the way, reads, "The cupboard's empty, to our sorrow, but hope it will be full tomorrow." It's kind of sad, isn't it? I love this presentation. Very simple way of creating a diorama almost, using photography and then interspersing within the photography in layers, these beautiful colored objects. This is at the Museum of Vancouver, and I thought this is just such an ingenious way of giving some dimension to and some context to the objects, but allowing them to really sing. What about this? This is glorious, gloriously simple, and I do believe that often our presentations are far too complex. It is wonderful seeing an object on its own, and this is made glorious by this wonderful soft lighting. This is at the Rijksmuseum in Holland. And what about this? This is an absolutely, truly astounding object, a Celtic shield found in the River Thames. It's 2,000 years old. It's presented at the British Museum. But look at the way it's presented. There's raked lighting to allow you to see the detail of the shield. It's presented on an angle, on a deep red background. It's absolutely stunning. And this beautiful, simple presentation of Islamic objects from the British Museum in an exhibition at the Royal BC Museum. And the Royal BC Museum's designers and technicians are really expert at lighting, but also simple presentations. So often keyed in labeling is just such a task for the visitor to work through. But this very simple use of keyed labels with the label very close to where the object is presented, and the object very simply mounted on stands or on a block and beautifully lit. We need to connect with the person. Freeman Tilden was a huge advocate of finding ways to connect and speak personally to the visitor as a human being. He said interpretation must relate to something within the visitor. That's why the masterstroke, which so reinforces the big idea, was this boarding card. The single thing that visitors remembered most from visiting the Titanic exhibit were not the objects salvaged from the bottom of the sea, were not pieces of the Titanic hull. They were this simple boarding pass which every visitor was given, and on the back was given an identity. Because this is the way that you would understand class as you traveled through the exhibition. You would be treated according to your class. And of course, at the end of the exhibition, you would then stand in front of the memorial wall and look for your name. Incredibly powerful experience. I am really intrigued by simple physical interactives in the form of asking a question and inviting visitors to respond. You've probably seen these blackboards in various places around the world with this very provocative question: before I die, I want to. And look at what happens. This is such an interesting phenomenon. It's extremely low tech. People are inspired by what other people write. So as soon as somebody writes something that is unusual or challenging or interesting in some particular way, other people respond in like kind. I've got to tell you, my very favorite in this is, I don't know if you can see it here, bottom right. Before I die, I want to swim in a pool of golden retriever puppies. And what about this? An art exhibit that is in fact simply a white room and a marker pen, in which the visitor is invited to make their mark, their date of birth, the date that they visited the exhibition, their name, and their height. This is from the Tate, St. Ives, an exhibition called Measuring Up, in which, because the art is created through a visitor being present in the room and making their mark, the visitor then feels that they are joining a greater body of humanity, and it becomes a pattern on the wall. It's absolutely remarkable. I love this. So simple. Just asking people a question, allowing people a chance to express themselves, to be an agent in an exhibition, not just a passive recipient. And I don't know, I'm not advocating smoking. I'm just saying there is a way to deal with cigarette butts in a way that draws people in and allows them to vote. In this case, a choice between two football players. We need to work harder to find the story. There is a storytelling challenge in every object. Sadly, I think we don't work hard enough to pull the object from the the story from the object. You know, in the 19th century, there were people, gentlemen like this one, Thomas Henry Huxley, who made their living by giving lectures. And Huxley gave a lecture in the 19th century called On a Piece of Chalk. Not a lecture that I necessarily would want to be a part of, but listen to the way in which Huxley begins the lecture. As a masterclass of interpretation, he said this: "If a well were sunk at our feet in the midst of a city, the diggers would soon find themselves at work with a white substance almost too soft to call rock. Later, we will learn that the chalk bed extends 3,000 miles to Asia. Every Norwich carpenter carries a bit of this chalk. The language of chalk is not hard to understand. I propose we set to work to spell out that story together." Huxley invites us on a journey of discovery as a companion. It's beautiful. Here is a masterclass of storytelling. To me, this was such an informative experience. How do you tell the story of such an epic event as a tornado? Well, the Minnesota History Center have set the standard for me anyway, as storytellers. They do it very cleverly. They do it in a nimble, light way and a way that is inexpensive. And it is remarkable what you can do with a budget of less than $10,000. This is the story of a tornado. It's told in the basement of a room. You enter this space, you sit on a couch, you're not sure what's going to happen. A television sparks into life, it's the news. The news is playing, it's 1962. You're still not sure what's happening. The television goes off. The radio on the bench comes on. It's broadcasting a warning, and you realize that the room is gradually changing. The light bulb flickers off. The light changes outside of this little window ahead of you. Plants are beginning to move. You hear a rumble. You feel a vibration. The room begins to vibrate, and you realize this is what it's like to be in the room in your house when a tornado passes right above you. Eventually, the television flickers back to life, and archival news footage is telling you about the destruction of a tornado in 1962. It is called object theater. It is such a simple device to tell a story through an orchestration of sound, light, and objects. We need to write well. I think it's so sad to see label writing sort of relegated to the end of the exhibition process and scrambled together at the last minute, which I've seen so many in exhibit projects. I think you need to write with boldness. I think you need to write with brevity. Freeman Tilden talks about brevity as being a principle of interpretation. And you need to write with an editor, not yourself. It's a wonderful resource. If you go to the Alliance of American Museums every year, they give awards to label writing. And just looking at them and learning from their example, I think is so informative. This simple artwork, Charles Ephraim Birchfield's Song of the Cicada, this is what the label says. Imagine August. Feel the press of the hot, humid air against your skin. A sluggish breeze carries the scent of browning grass, and everywhere the swelling sound of cicada song rises and falls, rises and falls. How did Charles Ephraim Birchfield visually convey this experience? How does he evoke such physical sensations as summer heat and the sound of insects through the simple means of charcoal, ink, and paper? What courage to start a label with a two-word sentence, Imagine August. What beautiful, simple writing. Or how about this? You see, genius is found not always in expensive exhibitions. In fact, this is an exhibit that probably cost almost nothing. You can see a blurry image of it there. And this is what the label says. A clean delivery kit, a bar of soap, a clean plastic sheet to slip under the mother's hips, a razor to cut the cord, string to tie it, and a 10-step diagram to guide the midwife. In rural Nepal, where 90% of deliveries take place at home, this box saves lives. It's a list, but look at that delivery of that final sentence. It's so powerful, as is this. This is from the Seaport Museum in Philadelphia, a very simple exhibit. And this is what the panel says. For sale at a Philadelphia slave market. You stand high above a gathering crowd. Everyone stares at you, inspecting you. A man shouts. You don't understand his language. You don't know what he's saying. People in the crowd shout back at him. He shouts, they shout, he shouts. And then your child is torn from your arms and you're in chains. What a powerful way of describing an auction of a human being without using the word auction. What powerful dramatic language. We need to work hard at our labels. We have the chance every time we create an exhibition to create a special place. That's why people go to museums, to step outside of their everyday life, to go to a special place. The builders of the great cathedrals of Europe knew this, as did the designers of the food hall in Harrods in London. And so too, the art installations at the Tate Modern. These are special places. These are environments that have been transformed. And let's just take a quick look at what's been done in the grand turbine hall at the Tate Modern. This is called the Weather Project by Olafur Eliasson. Incredible installation of a giant orb, an atmosphere, and a mirror on the ceiling. And what about Ai Weiwei filling the turbine hall with millions upon millions of handmade sunflower seeds? Or what about Shibboleth, a 545-foot long crack in the floor? This is actually a crack in the floor, not a visual illusion. These are special places. Sometimes it's done with the most simple device. Judy Rand, award-winning exhibit developer and label writer, wrote a paper and gave a presentation at American Museum Conference talking about her 10 favorite museum experiences. And one of them was here at the Royal BC Museum, this kitchen. It was the first time she'd ever experienced the smell in an exhibition. In this case, the smell of a cooking apple pie. So simple and yet so powerful. Transformation of a human being into a special place. Sometimes we need to have the courage to say no to technology. Look, this is happening. We can't put an end to this. We can't suddenly remove, no matter how much some of us perhaps would like to, the presence of the smartphone in our lives. But should we be catering to this or providing a respite from it? Technology has a place, but only when it furthers the story. It's not a surprise to me that the Rijksmuseum would create one of the most successful public events in their history is the removal on certain days of the cell phone and the cell phone camera. And instead giving everybody paper, a pad of paper or an easel, and encouraging them to express themselves through drawing. And look at this. I'm not advocating that we all go out there and shoot a bunch of African elephants, but I am saying Let's look at what's happening here at the Akeley Hall of African Mammals at the American Museum of Natural History. This is a museum exhibition that should be in a museum. It's a museum piece in a way. It is the most popular gallery in the entire exhibition. It was put together in the early 20th century. It has no technology in it. There are no interactives, and yet it still captures people's imagination, because how many times are any of us likely to stand at the foot of a herd of African elephants? Plan for change. When you create exhibitions, even when you think that you are going to change them sometime in the future, the chances are you may not. So somehow, into your design, build some flexibility. I mentioned the Minnesota History Center earlier on, have a wonderful model whereby a quarter of their entire exhibition budget is devoted to changing their permanent exhibits. No part of their permanent galleries is allowed to stand for more than 5 years. And so they have developed a way of light presentation, of not building heavy, ponderous exhibitions, but rather exhibitions that are intended to change, but also, when they're in place, to stimulate conversation. You're looking at 2 stacks of money in an exhibition on race. 1 stack of money is the amount that is likely to be earned by the average 30-year-old white American, and next to it is the stack of money that is likely to be earned by the average 30-year-old black American. And look at the way in which they design in a light, as a light touch is also a sort of whimsy to it, but the way they create exhibitions is done so that they are placing an emphasis on storytelling and never allowing these exhibitions to stay in place for very long. Place visitors first. Visitors should be first in your consideration as you plan an exhibition. You should be referring to the visitor as you plan, asking yourself, what does the visitor want to know? What do we want to happen to the visitor? How can we make the visitor comfortable? I once invited a colleague of mine from the Minnesota History Center to speak to my exhibit department, and he began the presentation by saying this: exhibitions don't teach visitors anything. Gasp. Exhibitions are environments that people explore on their own terms. I can't say how much I've come to hold this to be true as in my exhibition practice. And that's why we look at exhibitions like Daniel's Story at the United States Holocaust Museum, which was installed as a temporary exhibition in the mid-90s and is still there. It is because it takes the visitor very seriously. It is an exhibition about the Holocaust designed for children. And it is an environment that the visitor explores on their own terms, finding the content, exploring the fabric of the exhibition, and discovering the content, which is written to you. It speaks to you personally. It's a boy called Daniel telling you about his experience in the Holocaust. From the time he lived a fairly happy middle-class social life in Poland, to the time when the ghetto was formed and Jewish people were required to live in a particular part of the city, and in this case share a room with several other families. And you are seeing Daniel's experience through his eyes, in letters, in diary entries, in messages to you embedded in the exhibition. It is a bold, powerful exhibition. Bold because it's designed to speak to children about a very serious subject in which Daniel's family is sadly killed, although Daniel himself does live. Organize the story. Think about, when you're telling the story, the way in which it's organized so that visitors know what it's about, the big idea, where each part begins and ends, and where they are in the story as they travel through it. That's why I favor so much, and I see it now in exhibitions that I admire, the use of portals. The Royal BC Museum does this a lot. A portal into the exhibition to signal that you're entering a special place, and then a portal into each major chapter of the exhibition so that you know where you are. Let me say just a very quick word about introductions. Introductions to exhibitions rarely work, primarily because the visitor is urgently wanting to get into the experience, not to stand and read. Often because introductions are too long, often because they're placed in the wrong place. Usually on a wall before you get into the exhibition, or a wall just inside the exhibition. But look at this. This is called an advance organizer. This is a wonderful exhibition on collectors and collections at the Vancouver Museum of Vancouver. And this is a lobby to the exhibition in which you are informed what the exhibition is going to be about before you get into the exhibition. So there's a great advantage to doing your introducing before the visitor actually enters the exhibition. I need to find my way towards the end. I know I'm using up all of my time. Make comfort a priority. Be brief. Remember, the visitor is standing. Be brief in your exhibition label writing. Create places for visitors to rest and modulate the experience. The Royal BC Museum's designers in the 1970s knew about modulation. They created spaces of respite, like this little theatre, where you, off the main path of the exhibition, where you can rest before continuing your journey. I love this idea of benches, of folding chairs that the museums in London do, so that visitors can take a folding chair and put it where they want to sit. In fact, I've realized now that usually chairs or seating in exhibitions are put in the corners that are left over from the design. And I think it shouldn't be that way. I took this picture at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where these beautifully generous seating islands are placed exactly where people want to sit, not in a corner that's left over. And what about if the seating is part of the experience, if it's actually designed as experience? And what about putting seating in the best places? This is a series of chairs on a terrace at the Whitney Museum, the new Whitney Museum, looking out on this great view. Seek inspiration. I think the designers that I admire in the exhibit world are not always looking at other museum exhibits for their inspiration, but are looking elsewhere. They're looking at the design work of other designers, of architects, of graphic designers, of interior designers. And I use this as inspiration for myself, and as an example. This is not a museum exhibit. This is a youth library in Norway, the Bibliotoyen, a library in Oslo, Norway. What an incredible environment. What inspiration for any exhibit designer. So broaden your frame of reference. Look to copy others outside of the museum design world. And finally, we are there, the 12th principle. Don't be afraid of wonder. This is where it really works for museum visitors, when they are transported to a special place and for whatever reason that's personal to them are in a state of wonder. I think this last museum I must leave you with is, for me, the most wondrous experience that I've ever had visiting a museum. The Museum of Jurassic Technology on Venice Boulevard in Los Angeles. Not a very auspicious location. There it is, behind the traffic light. There's no great sign outside. There's this little brass plate that tells you the hours. I pressed a button. A woman opened the door. I had the most extraordinary visit because she said, as I came in, look, I have to go to the airport to pick somebody up. Here's the key. show yourself around, and on the way, drop it in a bucket at the back door. So I was in there alone, and this is what I encountered. Like a maze, a labyrinth. I wasn't quite sure what I was getting into when I went there. But there are these marvelous tiny spaces, this beautiful little oasis. As I wander around, exploring, just trying to discover the stories that are there, incredible objects. Often the displays are very small. It's a lesson in the power of tiny exhibitions. Whole galleries, tiny galleries devoted to stories like this of an opera singer and her lover who went missing in the Amazon. Here are her possessions, her personal possessions, her diary, her notes, her letters. And this story, like all of the other stories at the Museum of Jurassic Technology, could have been true, but weren't. Last words. Steal good ideas. I think any good idea that I possibly have is probably inspired or, in truth, stolen from other people. Learn to be self-critical. There is great power in learning from your mistakes and looking at what you do and not being satisfied ever with what you've produced, but always be pressing to improve the next time. Take risks and support creative risks if you're in charge of an exhibit team, and let wonder reign. This is the end of the lesson. Thank you very much for those of you who have hung in. I know it's lunchtime for many people, and I've gone a little bit over time. Ben is going to, after the webinar, going to send out a few handouts that I found useful in my practice recently. Judy Rand's Visitor Bill of Rights, wonderful manifesto. The AAM's standards for museum exhibitions, which actually try to define the criteria for gauging success, and this great practical guide for exhibitions design by the Glasgow Museums. And there's my contact information, shameless self-promotion. If you'd like to drop me a line or visit my website, if you have a question, I'd be happy to chat with you. Thank you very much. You've given me a great honor to spend this lunchtime talking about things that I am passionate about and love. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tim. And I think we didn't lose a single person through that whole talk. They're all
my voice.
They're all still enjoying it very much. So since there are still a few people, if you do need to sign off, we understand. But if there is anybody with questions, you can either put them in the Q&A section. I know there are a bunch of people that have already found the chat window as well. Either one, just drop your question in. I'll read it out loud. It looks like Alyssa asked, do we get a copy of Tim's PowerPoint? We can include that for sure. Tim can send a copy of that probably to me. You'll also get a recording of this. So either way. And I'm actually just going to share this back over onto my screen just while we talk about this. And you'll get a recording of that later as well. So let me see if there's any other questions here. We have one from Jahi. I hope I'm saying that correct. Do you have insight about great exhibits at zoos or aquaria where there are live animals instead of objects?
Well, yes. I'm no expert on zoos and aquaria. I have to say the Monterey Bay Aquarium is for me the standard. In terms of clarity of mission, they are very clear about what their brand and their mission is, and everything that they do supports it. They are regular winners of those awards, the American Alliance of Museums Awards for writing. Wonderful, simple, imaginative text writing for exhibits. And I have to say that they are very what would be called visitor-centered in all of their visitor experience. So they know that the visitor is of critical importance in all of their design decisions. So the Monterey Bay Aquarium stands out for me. I'm not really a zoo expert, so I can't really speak to that.
Okay, and Monterey Bay Aquarium got featured in Finding Dory, so they must be doing something right. Any examples of good use of technology in museum exhibits?
Oh yeah. I mean, I don't want to sound like a Luddite or anything. I just think there's like many things. I do think museums have felt compelled um, to take technological routes sometimes, probably for the wrong reasons. I think there is a bit of a sense of anxiety about being left behind in the technological age. That said, there are lots of people experimenting with technology. I just am underwhelmed by a lot of technology. I'm going to declare a bias here. I'm not a big fan of apps. I mean, apps are great on your phone, but in museums, I don't know, underwhelming. In most of my experiences. So be careful. I think I would say if you're going to use technology, make sure that it's furthering the story. I think one of the most successful uses of technology, and I know it has millions of dollars behind it, but is Gallery One at the Cleveland Museum of Art. If you go to their website, you can actually experience Gallery One. There's a wonderful video that takes you through it. Incredible use of technology and really successful. But they were very thoughtful in how they created the technology and measured its success afterwards.
Right, and I think that we did a bit of research on that when we were doing our last webinar in November, the last webinar of 2017, talking about technology. I think we figured it was a $10.5 million project for that, so maybe out of the reach of some museums, but definitely ideas that you can transfer over to other
Sure.
ones. And perhaps you could touch on that, Tim, if we have museums listening to us that have annual operating budgets in the in the 4 digits and the thousands of dollars a year, what would be their sort of best starting point to start along these bits of advice that you've talked about, or maybe to refresh their thing?
I mean, I think, in teaching exhibition design, I use a lot of examples from large museums, but I use them because the principles are transferable all the way to the smallest of museums. I mean, creating great labels and presenting objects clearly doesn't require any more budget than you have right now. It doesn't matter what your budget is. So I think, and I love it, that in the label awards, you see awards going to really small museums who've done something brilliant with their label writing. So I think finding the story, organizing it simply, writing great labels and presenting objects simply and powerfully is something that isn't budget dependent on. So does that answer the question? I can't remember what the question was.
I think that's a good starting point for a lot of museums, because museums of all sizes have labels. So perhaps that's.
I think when I first got into the business, and I knew nothing about. I didn't come from a museum background, but I think by nature I must be a thief or something, or a copycat. But I just found it I found that watching what other people do and learning from it is probably the greatest advice I would give somebody going into our field. I think virtually every exhibition idea has been done in some form before. So I think the greatest thing you can do is simply open your mind and look at what other people are doing.
Right. We have 2 more questions here. Another one from Melissa. What are some tips or great examples you may have on sharing a big story in a small physical space?
Well, the Museum of Jurassic Technology, which really nothing is off limits to them. They deal with enormous questions of theology and philosophy, and so they give themselves enormous challenges from a storytelling point of view, and then do it really simply and on a tiny scale. I think the thing that we are all guilty of in the museum business is trying to do too much. So I think I would say that if you're going to tell and a large story. Spend some creative time brainstorming of how to do it simply, first of all, because the larger the story tends to generate the more complex response in a design. You saw in the case of the Minnesota History Center, the giant sort of story of a tornado is actually rendered in a very simple, crude way in that little basement setting. I'm not quite sure giving you the answer you need, other than to say, which I tend to go on a little bit too much about it, which is that I think we need to say less rather than more, even if we are telling a giant story.
Mm-hmm. And be creative with how you say it, I'm sure, too.
Yeah.
Okay, and one from Doug. Doug asks, when have you been most surprised by a visitor in your exhibition?
Well, I mean, it is always surprising what the visitor is taking away from our exhibitions. I think we tend to overinflate what we think visitors are able to absorb. I did stand behind a group of people going through Old Town, a family going through Old Town in the Royal BC Museum, which is a beautiful, detailed recreation of a street. I mean, it's astonishing in its day and still is today. And one member of the family turned to the other and said, it's just like Las Vegas, isn't it? And I thought, what? I can't quite get my head around that. But yes, I realized that, you know, there are lots of people now doing what museums used to do who are not in the museum business. And so, you know, creating environments is like that is not the preserve of museums anymore. It's done in theme parks and all over the place. I also, I have to give you one, the first exhibit I ever did was a robotic animals exhibit, a prehistoric animals exhibit, which were very big in the 1990s. And this was the first that our museum had ever done. And it was a novelty, to say the least. Giant robotic dinosaurs, moving dinosaurs and Ice Age beasts. And it was both a overwhelming success. We had close to 500,000 visitors, and it was also an unmitigated disaster, at least on the first few days, because it created chaos as people lined up to get into it. And the first exhibit they saw was a saber-toothed cat on top of a dead mammoth, and tiny children were hysterical and couldn't go into the exhibit, and parents were trying to drag them in, and children were screaming, frightened to death. And it's always stuck with me because it was so chaotic. But the thing that hit me one day was I came across a little boy and a girl coming out of the exhibition, and brother and sister. She was a little bit older than him, and she said to him, he was crying, and she said to him, "Don't worry, they're not real, except for one." And I thought that was probably the scariest thing she could have said to him. But you never know. You never know when you create an exhibition what people are going to take away from it.
Especially kids.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Tim. We hope that everybody who is still signed on, I see there's still a whole bunch of you, you can join us next month. We're having a really interesting webinar next month with David Alexander, Daphne Wood, and Daniel Collings. I'm going to call it the 3D webinar or something. We're doing the MOU in Action, a toolkit for the BC GLAM sector partners on March 20th. And this is a special webinar about a memorandum of understanding that the BCMA, the BC Library Association, and the Archives Association of BC partnered on last year. It's the first of its kind in North America, possibly in the world, that we know of, where the three provincial sectors or organizations working in the GLAM sector, galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, are working together to create professional development, to create resources, to improve the sector together. And so they have been working on a toolkit for our sector for collaborative work, resource sharing, information sharing, etc. and they're going to present sort of the first view of it. It will be released in May, as far as I understand, but they will be presenting the first view of it for us on March 20th, and they're also looking for feedback. So this is a great opportunity for you to sort of participate in the design of this toolkit and this resource that is such an innovative one in our sector right now. Tickets are now open. You can get those on the website, on our website, which is museumsassn.bc.ca. And we are also moving to a new online members portal. So if you are a member, you'll have all this information at the click of a button on your portal. And if you're not a member, you can still actually access the resources a little bit easier. We will be sending out a follow-up email with information about that on March 1st for how you can access the recording to this webinar. I know some people were asking about that as well. Now, if you are interested in being like Tim and presenting your own webinar, you can still do that as well. We have spots from, I believe it's from August on, still open. So feel free to get your proposal in for that. And I will be sending a little follow-up survey when we get this webinar recording finished, and it'll be in your inboxes soon. We really appreciate it if you can take a couple minutes to fill that out and tell us what you want to see in future webinars or how we can improve the platform, all that sort of thing. So I'd like to thank you, Tim, once again for doing this presentation. And I know there were a lot of people signed on and very interested in it. The chat window was full of thanks to you as well. So thank you very much, everybody. And I'll be sending around those resources that Tim had as well in that follow-up email. So look for those in a couple hours. Perfect. Thanks, Tim. Have a good one.
Bye-bye, everybody. Bye, Ben.
Bye.